7 years later, the crime itself hasn't changed. The evidence hasn't moved. The sentences haven't softened. And yet Chris Watts sits in a prison interview room and claims that only now has he finally spoken the truth. Time has passed, but nothing has healed. The silence that followed the murders has simply been filled with new words, words that arrive long after they can make a difference. The world thought this story ended years ago. Confessions were made, guilty pleas were entered, life sentences were handed down. For most people, the case was sealed, filed away as one of the most disturbing family annihilations in modern history. But for Chris Watts, the story never stopped evolving. Each retelling, each interview, each statement subtly shifted, as though the truth itself were something flexible, something that could be adjusted, once the consequences were already permanent. When someone says they finally told the truth after 7 years, it forces an uncomfortable question. Why now? What changed? Prison offers a lot of time. Time to think, to replay events, to reframe memories in ways that feel easier to live with. And sometimes, truth spoken this late isn't about clarity, it's about control. Control over how the story is remembered when nothing else is left. Chris speaks calmly, measured, as if time has granted him authority over the narrative. But time doesn't automatically bring honesty. Sometimes, it simply dulls the urgency. When there is nothing left to lose, words become safer to release. Stories like this matter, not because they shock, but because they reveal how narratives can keep shifting long after justice is served. If you're here for careful, reflective true crime that looks beyond the headlines, take a moment to like and subscribe to Dark Evidence. These stories don't end when the news cycle does. Because if Chris Watts says he's speaking the truth now, 7 years later, the real question is this: was the truth hidden all this time, or has it simply changed shape to suit him? 7 years is a long time to sit with your own story. In prison, days blur together, marked by routine and repetition. For Chris Watts, that time became a space where the past could be replayed endlessly, not just as it happened, but as he chose to remember it. With no freedom left to protect, the only thing still within his control was the narrative itself. Over the years, his accounts have shifted in tone and detail. Not in ways that dramatically change the facts, but in ways that change how responsibility feels. Each version seems slightly more reflective, slightly more self-aware, at least on the surface. But reflection does not always equal honesty. Sometimes it's simply adaptation. A way to survive mentally inside a reality that cannot be escaped. Memory itself is not fixed. It bends under guilt, shame, and repetition. When someone retells a story often enough, especially in isolation, it can slowly transform into something that feels true, even if it wasn't. The danger in delayed truth is that it can become less about what actually happened, and more about what the speaker needs to believe happened. Chris's claim that he's now telling the truth raises another unsettling idea, that earlier versions were incomplete by design. Not because the facts weren't known, but because revealing them then would have required facing consequences that felt unbearable. Now, with time passed and punishment settled, truth becomes safer to handle. If this perspective makes you pause, consider sharing this story. Conversations like these keep us questioning how truth and time interact, especially in cases where accountability is already decided. Because time doesn't always reveal honesty. Sometimes it simply gives lies room to evolve. And as the years stretch on, the line between truth, memory, and self-protection becomes harder to see, especially when the person speaking has nothing left to lose except how they're remembered. While Chris Watts' version of events continued to evolve, everything outside of his prison walls remained frozen in time. Shanann's voice still exists in messages, videos, and memories that never change. Her words don't adjust with the years. They don't soften or shift. They remain exactly as they were, preserved in moments that ended far too soon. This is where delayed truth becomes complicated. When someone speaks years later, the impact doesn't fall on them alone. It ripples outward, reopening wounds for families, reshaping public understanding, and forcing those left behind to relive what they have already endured. A confession offered late does not arrive in silence. It arrives in a space already filled with grief. For the victims, time did not bring evolution. It brought permanence. Their stories were sealed the moment their lives ended. But Chris still has the ability to speak, to reinterpret, to add context to a narrative that others can no longer respond to. That imbalance matters. It raises the question of whether truth, spoken this late, serves justice, or simply the speaker. When the public hears new claims years later, there's a temptation to see them as revelations. But revelation without consequence can become distortion. Accountability requires timing. It requires truth when it can still protect, still prevent, still matter in real time. If this part of the story resonates with you, take a moment to leave a comment. Ask yourself whether truth has an expiration date, or whether it loses meaning the longer it's withheld. Because 7 years later, the most uncomfortable realization may be this: the truth didn't arrive late for Chris Watts, but it arrived too late for everyone else. When Chris Watts says he finally told the truth, the words sound simple, almost ordinary. But it's not what he says that draws attention. It's how he says it, and what he carefully leaves untouched. His language is controlled, deliberate, stripped of urgency. There is no risk in these words anymore. No legal consequence, no threat of change, only interpretation. He speaks as if time itself has validated him, as though 7 years of silence somehow transformed this version into the most authentic one. But truth does not gain credibility simply by waiting. In many cases, delay becomes a shield. It allows responsibility to be framed rather than faced. It gives space to soften edges, to shift focus from action to emotion, from consequence to intention. What's striking is how these late confessions often center the speaker. The pain is acknowledged, but at a distance. The gravity is present, but abstract. By revisiting the story now, Chris regains something prison took from him: the ability to influence how he is perceived. Narrative becomes the last form of control. This is where ethical questions surface. When someone has nothing left to lose, should their words be treated as clarity or caution? Does speaking late reflect remorse or relief? And can truth exist without accountability in the moment it mattered most? If you find yourself questioning these statements, consider supporting this channel by liking and subscribing to Dark Evidence. These stories deserve careful attention, not sensational conclusions. Because when truth is spoken only after consequences are final, we're left wondering whether honesty was ever the goal, or whether shaping memory is the final act. 7 years later, the truth, whatever shape it takes, can no longer change the outcome. Lives were lost. Futures were erased. No confession, no clarification, no late arriving honesty can undo that reality. What remains is interpretation, and the weight of deciding how much value delayed truth should hold. Chris Watts's claim that he has finally spoken honestly invites reflection, not resolution. Because truth that arrives after everything is settled does not carry the same responsibility as truth spoken when it could have stopped harm. It exists in a vacuum, where accountability has already been assigned and consequences are fixed. In that space, words risk becoming less about remorse and more about legacy. For those who listen, the challenge is separating insight from influence, to ask whether understanding motive helps us prevent future tragedies, or whether it simply allows the perpetrator one final voice. True crime often focuses on what happened, but cases like this force us to confront why timing matters just as much as truth itself. The victim's stories do not evolve with the years. They remain unchanged, preserved in the moment everything ended. Meanwhile, the narrative of the person responsible continues to shift, shaped by time, isolation, and the human need to make sense of the irreversible. If this story made you pause, share it with someone who values thoughtful discussion, and leave a comment, because how we interpret stories like this says as much about us as it does about the case itself. These conversations matter, not for fascination, but for awareness. So, as we step away from this chapter, one final question lingers, uncomfortable and unresolved. If the truth is only spoken when nothing can be changed, was it ever meant to be the truth, or just the last version of the story we're asked to believe?